England's Chief Inspector of Schools has announced a bold 5-year plan. She promises more inspections, more research, more intervention to help schools and childcare get over the trauma of lockdown. But the mood in the staff rooms and at the school gates is fractious. Can Amanda Spielman convince teachers and parents she's the person to safeguard the interests of children? And she's with me now in the studio. Amanda, thanks so much for coming in. I wanted to start with COVID and where we are now at school, in schools. As a country, we've been encouraged to move past the pandemic to get people back to work, back to normal. Do you believe there will be long-term consequences in the state school system because of COVID around the pandemic and also the lack of funding, sufficient funding for kids to catch up?
I do think there will be consequences. At one level, we're back to normal. Schools aren't operating with COVID restrictions, lockdowns, bubbles, all the rest of it. But it's been an incredibly tough couple of years. Heads, teachers are weary. They've been working so hard. And a great many children have really struggled. It's been very, very tough for them. So while everybody's back in school, there's a lot to catch up on, and it's really hard work with really tired people. So absolutely, there's a lot of effects still to come through. And
Amanda, your job obviously is to inspect schools and look at standards. Sir Kevin Collins, who you'll know, he was briefly the Prime Minister's education czar. Back in the moment when the government was talking about schools and recovery, he asked for £15 billion to help put funding into schools to help kids in state schools catch up. And in the end, the government, I think, offered up about £3 billion in additional funding. When he stood down, he said, "I do not believe it will be possible to deliver a successful recovery without significantly greater support than the government has to date indicated it intends to provide." Do you agree with him?
I'd like to wind a step back and talk about the ways in which COVID has affected children. We've got some children who are really catching up pretty well in the normal classroom with their normal teachers, making accelerated progress. That's quite a large proportion, actually. So I don't think we should be too pessimistic overall. But of course, we've got some who, for all sorts of reasons, are a lot further behind. And structured intervention to help them is really important. A great deal of that comes from the school's own staff. And in fact, one of the things we've seen about tutoring, about all the tutoring that schools are putting in place with the National Tutoring Programme, is they've actually got a strong preference for using their own staff over staff supplied from other sources. So actually, it's interesting that schools want to work with their own resource if they possibly can. And I think a great deal of really good tutoring and catch-up interventions is being organised that way. So I'm not as pessimistic as some. We are working on this. We're looking at it.
But Kevin had a point, do you think, Kevin Collins?
Yeah, but there was also a question, because one of the things that's transpired is it's actually been quite difficult to find enough tutors and to find the right tutors who can tie in. So if there had been a huge amount of extra money in school budgets, I'm not sure that we would have had extra tutors to spend it all on. So the most important thing is to do it really, really well and have it very tightly integrated with what happens in the classroom.
Amanda, let me put it another way, because we're also seeing, and you'll know this, the gap between state school funding and private school funding almost double. This investment, money going into school fees for private schools, funding per pupil dropping in real terms in England. As head of Ofsted, are you concerned by this growing inequality between education?
It seems that there's been an arms race in the private sector for years.
Right.
Somebody builds a theatre, somebody else has to build an even grander sports pitch. The facilities race in the private sector has been quite extraordinary. I think a lot of that's been about attracting people from overseas. I don't think it bears any relationship to what happens in the state system here or anywhere else, come to that. And I also don't think it's necessarily has a great deal to do with the education outcomes.
But you don't think it entrenches inequality between those children that can go to a private school and those children that can't?
It does entrench some undesirable kinds of equality. But if we look across the world, state systems everywhere in developed countries are operating with quite similar amounts of funding. English schools are very much in the normal range. So the first job is to make sure we use what we've got really well, think in a very structured way about curriculum and teaching, and make sure that children have the very best experience. I truly believe we make fantastic schools.
OK, Amanda, well, let's come on to your strategy. You put out a 5-year strategy this week to try and address the devastating impact on the pandemic, with a big focus on the early years, flagging that there are children lagging in communication and languages skills, some of the skills, some of the preschool kids. Is that your biggest area of concern when you look across the piece of early years to secondary education?
We've got concerns right through. We've done a particularly large amount of work on school age and post-16 over the last 5 years. In the light of COVID, we've seen particular harm for the youngest children. And remember, children who have just turned 2, say, have lived all their lives in a pandemic. They've seen adults around them with face masks. They've seen far fewer people than usual. It's not surprising that for so many of them, their language and communication development are well behind where they would normally be, that their social skills are less developed. So getting them back on track has got to be a really big priority, and that's why we've put it right in the centre of our new strategy. And
as I understand it, the Cabinet talked about this week looking at cutting childcare costs because of the cost of living crisis by diluting the ratio of adults to kids in early years education. You know that one adult at the moment I think has 3 children. Would you worry about that in the context of what you're talking about, that actually they need more input? Is that a concern to you?
I think it's really important to look comparatively here. I've seen OECD analysis that says we've got the most generous staffing ratios in the developed world for early education. Of course, there's a trade-off between staffing and cost. It's very important that we protect the quality of education and the quality of care for children. But I do think it's right to look and look at it to make sure that we're not gold plating, that we're making that we've got early education as affordable as it can be, as well as really high quality.
So in principle, you're not opposed to the loosening of those ratios in principle?
I don't think ratios of themselves drive quality. We should look at quality of education, quality of care and safeguarding first and foremost.
OK. One other thing I wanted to ask you about in relation to children's education is something that the government's Social Mobility Commissioner said yesterday. She told a group of MPs that girls shy away from studying physics because they don't like hard maths. What was your response to that? What do you think of that?
Oh, I think it was a terribly unfortunate thing for her to say. It really was. There is an imbalance between girls and boys. It's a rather large imbalance by the time you get to post-16 study of subjects like physics and further maths. But I turn it around and say, actually, in some ways it's telling us something about girls' strengths. So many girls get to age 16, say, and find that they're all-rounders, that they're equally good at everything, and really struggle to decide what not to pursue, because at that age we do make young people choose. Boys, by contrast, are much more likely to be much better at maths and science than they are at sort of language-based subjects. So it's much more likely for them to be a no-brainer to stick with the maths and science route. And at one level, of course, we don't want to march children off and say, even if you don't want to do history, to do maths, you want to do history, you're not going to do history. But we should be concerned when disproportionately girls shut themselves out of some of the most interesting, some of the most lucrative and some of the most socially valuable paths. It's the technologists and scientists who are solving climate change.
A bit of a foolish thing to say, really, then, given the efforts to get girls into STEM subjects.
There's some fantastic efforts in hand, and of course we must balance the rights of individuals with wider social aims. But yes, a very unfortunate thing to say.
Let's get on to you briefly. I've got lots of other things to ask you about, but Amanda, you are not a teacher by background, and anyone who's a teacher or lives with a teacher, and my mum was a teacher, so I remember the shadow of fear cast by an Ofsted inspection. She was a head teacher, and believe me, it was a painful period in our house when there was an Ofsted inspection. But with previous inspectors, Chris Woodhead or Michael Wilshaw, they were fellow teachers, and you aren't. You were someone that was from the city, trained and worked in the city. Has that been a barrier for you with teachers? Do you think that sometimes they think you don't understand the pressures they're under because you haven't walked in their shoes?
I'm sure that happens sometimes, but I think what people lose sight of is that it was actually only until my late 30s that I worked in the city, and then I changed career and I've worked in education since for the last 20 years. So I did a master's in education, and then I became part of the founding team at what's now one of the biggest academy chains. So I have lived and breathed education from the point of view of somebody running an academy chain, really getting into the problems of the most disadvantaged schools. The chain I worked for was particularly targeted at children with the steepest path to climb. We were taking on the toughest schools, working out what curriculum, what teaching were needed, working out what it would take to turn those schools around. And I was doing that for years before I came into this job. So I have seen all the things that can go wrong with a school and all the things that can go right with a school at very close quarters, and been working intimately with the people who are directly responsible in those schools.
And Amanda, coming on to working in schools and some of the cultural issues around schools, in the US there's been a situation where schools and curricula is becoming a battleground, a political battleground. Do you fear that happening here? You recently said that schools have to tread a careful path between being damned for being intolerant or slammed for being woke. What do you mean by that?
This country, fortunately, is not polarised at the level that I think we're seeing in the United States. But nevertheless, there are some very, very hot political contests. And of course, many of those are things that children become aware about. And so, of course, it's right that schools talk about politics, talk about current and topical issues. But there's an important requirement on schools, which is to be politically impartial. And that's small p political. It's not about whether they talk about Conservative or Labour or Lib Dems. It's in the broader sense. They've got to make sure that they give children a sort of balanced diet overall, and that they don't teach contested ideas as fact or doctrine.
And you think they're doing that, or they're in danger of doing that?
In the main, most schools walk this line really well, but it's very hard at the moment because there are some very passionate voices. And when something is presented as a sort of moral issue rather than a political issue, it can become hard for people who are really engaged in something that for them is very much a moral issue to recognise where it's something.
Can you give me an example?
What's a good example? We did an inspection recently of an independent school, which had a curriculum which was very much about social justice, and which we did find didn't meet the political impartiality expectations. But the teachers there very much saw it as the moral value of teaching this curriculum overrode political impartiality. But they found it hard to see that.
Let me go on to something else about gender and schools. Is it important that schools maintain single-sex provision for girls using toilets and changing rooms, for example, in your view?
This is one of the toughest ones for schools at the moment, and it is coming up more and more and more. We're hearing about this. Although it hasn't come up in inspection much yet, we know it's getting to be a bigger issue in schools. Adolescence is a time when everybody's exploring sexuality, increasingly gender, all kinds of other aspects of their identity. And schools have to stay on top of that. So they do have to handle children with gender identity issues sensitively. Yes. But safeguarding children, biological sex absolutely is and continues to be relevant right the way through.
So you think it does matter to have single-sex provision for girls?
Each school... Every school has to work out its own arrangements, but it's important to recognise that we've got sort of conflicting rights here. This is not something that you can steamroll, and we have to acknowledge that some of the gender issues come directly into conflict with some of the sex-based rights.
But Amanda, would your message be to schools that have removed single-sex spaces, what's your message to them, that they shouldn't?
My message is that they've got to make sure that the very real tensions here have been aired, discussed, that they've got buy-in for whatever solution. Right. This is we don't prescribe what schools do when conflicts between rights arise. This is not the first time that we found ourselves in a place where we can see a clear conflict of rights. So much of my time at Ofsted, we've been dealing with places where religious rights and sex rights conflict, and we found illegal segregation, or where religion and sexuality conflict, where religious schools don't want to teach about homosexuality, for example. I have to go to the break. I've got one quick question for you. On the issue of single-sex schools, over 50% of teachers in England have said they have at least one pupil who's identified as transgender. Do you still think single-sex schools will exist in a generation's time, or will society have moved on from that form of demarcation between people? There are certainly far fewer single-sex schools than there once were, but in a world where parent choice matters, I'd be very reluctant to see a mandate that there should be no single-sex schools. Yes, issues of gender identity create some difficulties at the borderline, no question about that. But I certainly wouldn't be calling to abolish them.
All right, well, Amanda, we've run out of time. Thank you. That was fascinating.